Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Seal, and I'm a technology, media, and telecoms reporter at Bloomberg. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this panel discussion on bridging the digital divide. I'll just say a few words about that subject and then introduce our panelists. Through dealing with COVID, connectivity has become an even bigger part of our lives than it was before, shaping our work, study, and social lives. But the pandemic also exposed a digital divide between those who could move to digital working and studying and those who couldn't. So to dig into this subject and how it's being tackled, I'm joined by three experts: Alejandra Ceja, Executive Director of the Panasonic Foundation; Sampath Sowmyanarayan, Chief Revenue Officer at Verizon Business; and Mike Murphy, Chief Technology Officer at Ericsson North America. It's great to have you all with us, and let's just get right into some questions, and just please feel free to jump in if you have anything to say or want to respond to another panelist's points. To kick off, I thought we could start on governments and intervention. They intervened in our lives and business to an almost unprecedented extent through COVID. And to anyone who'd like to go first, what role can governments play in supporting the technology and the change needed to bridge some of these divides, and are they doing the right things at the moment? So,
sure.
Alejandra, would you like to start?
I definitely think government plays a role. As somebody who comes from a government background, working at the Department of Education previously, I do think there's an opportunity for us to leverage public-private partnerships in support of bridging the digital divide. I think that there's some innovation that's coming out of this new administration that will make a difference. And working in the private sector for Panasonic, I think there's an opportunity for us to collaborate. It's that collective action, that shared responsibility that I think will help us make greater inroads, especially in communities of color.
And look, you can't solve it.
Sorry, Sampath.
Look, you can't solve this with just the private sector or the public sector. We both have to do this together. Look, there are three things when we look at this. One is affordability. Can you afford the service? Second is accessibility. Do you have the service? And the third is usability. Can you use it? And this digital divide is a sum of all these three things. Each of them have a different solution set. Look, the usability thing, I think, can be solved relatively straightforward. You have computers, price points have come down, that can be solved. I think it's affordability and accessibility is where a lot of the work is. And as Alejandro said, we cannot solve it alone. It's a big enough problem that's going to have to bring private and the public sector together.
Yeah, that's right. I think we both have a role to play. Certainly, we see that we have a role to play, and we're doing our part there. And as Alejandro mentioned, in some sense, the stars are aligning that we, in a bad way, we have the urgent need as demonstrated by COVID. But on the positive side, we have the $65 billion funding from the IIGA, and also $20 billion from RDOF. And also we have some new technical options that are coming up. So while we're a little bit dominated by fiber solutions in the past, with 5G and new spectrum, we have some good alternatives that are approaching, if not even exceeding, fiber alternatives. And they're good in the sense that you can get perhaps lower cost solutions at a faster time. So I think also on the government side, we need to look at all options that are available and be a little bit technology neutral when we do that. And as Sampath mentioned, it's not only the connectivity, it's also the affordability and the training as well.
You actually touched on my next question there, Mike, which is, I suppose, the mix of technology that's going to be needed. All of your businesses work across a range of connectivity and services. What mix of technology is going to be needed, and how has our understanding of that changed over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so, historically, we've always looked at fiber as the solution, but it's actually about 8 times more expensive to deploy in rural settings compared to urban settings. And if we look at the history on this, partially because of that cost and the trenching, we're only growing at about an anemic pace of 1.5% per year. So as I mentioned, we have 5G as an alternative now. We also have low Earth orbit satellites that are coming up and providing pretty good solutions. Starlink got a good share of the RDOF funding in the past, in the phase 1 allocations. So we have this nice mix that's perhaps going to help accelerate resolving some of the connectivity issues as well.
Yeah, and we've seen it for the first time. Historically, it's all been fiber. We love fiber for all the right reasons, but as you get to the last 20% of the country, the math doesn't always add up. So for the first time, I've been waiting my whole career to say this: wireless solutions are a credible option. It works. We call it fixed wireless access or business internet or home internet. It's a really good option, and it's also pretty quick. You get it in a box, FedEx, UPS box, you turn it up, you may have an antenna, and you're up and running. It's nationwide as well. It's a very credible option to bridge the digital divide. And part of it is a lot of the government has done good work in rolling out spectrum, the C-band spectrum, as well as the millimeter wave spectrum options that have come. I've made the math work. Because historically, it was a math issue. We couldn't make the math work on that. So finally, we do right now, and fixed wireless is real for us. And it's nationwide, at least at Verizon.
And Alejandra, what do you make of the kind of the changing mix? We wouldn't have been mentioning Starlink, for instance, even 3 years ago.
I think that the times we're living through just gives us an opportunity to really create a sense of urgency around making sure we can have connectivity in the communities of greatest need. I think the pandemic has really magnified the level of poverty in this country. And, we have great experts on this call, right? What is that next step to make sure we can reach those communities that really need the access? So that's what we're focused on at the Panasonic Foundation is how can we leverage strategic partnerships to make sure that we're not just talking about the issue at hand, but that we're actually making meaningful actions to make sure communities of color, students that have been hit the hardest, that we know don't have access to the internet, don't have access to computers, that we can close that opportunity gap. So I'm really excited for the conversation because I think that there's some solutions we're aware of, and now it's just a matter of how can we work together to make sure we can implement them in those hard to hit communities.
And is that going to be
and we shouldn't
sorry, Mike.
Sorry, Thomas. And we shouldn't forget that, as we resolve the fixed connectivity, we don't want to create a mobility divide as well. I was just looking at Pew Research, who said that 27% of low-income households access the internet through mobile phones. So we also need to resolve the mobility divide, not only for subscribers with mobile phones, but also for businesses. Because what we'd like to create is this virtual cycle where we can get businesses into the right areas as well and try to solve this problem in a systemic way.
And on one of those three levers that we mentioned at the beginning of the call, affordability, I'm interested in Alejandra's point there about, many communities, that they might have 5G over their heads, but it's no good to them because it's not affordable, or they don't have the handset or the other devices that they might need. So what's being done? Are there any examples we can talk about of where that might have been successfully addressed, kind of good case studies? Getting laptops to schools, for instance, people who may not have otherwise had access to students rather.
Yeah, we did look when the pandemic hit. At its peak of the pandemic, we had schools went remote. They just couldn't get access to getting their homework done. It was a huge problem. So I think there were 3 states that come to mind: Georgia, Massachusetts, and of course the LA Unified School District, where literally within weeks or even days, we put together these very low-cost plans so that kids could do their homework at home and then access education. It's really successful. I think right now almost 30 million students have access to our program, and it's very affordable programs we do. The second piece, and I think Alejandra touched on this quite nicely, which is in the past, a digital divide had to do with you couldn't access Netflix or Instagram. Today, a digital divide means you can't do your homework, you can't catch up on your study, you can't get access to telehealth. So the digital divide is real, and it's also generational. In other words, if someone gets left behind, the generation that comes after that will be in a disadvantage. So it's much bigger stakes than it's ever been before. And the school program is just one of the starters, but we all have a lot more work to do here.
I think that's a great point. I think the stakes are definitely high. And I think not just for our communities of color, but for us as a country and how we compete globally, our competitiveness here in the 21st century. I do want to just flag that for us, one of the things we've seen is working, like trying to really leverage public-private partnerships, working with the nonprofit community, the after-school community, school districts, Title I schools, helping us think outside of the box as a company, as a tech innovation company. Panasonic is really looking for those partners that can help us figure out how we can make sure our investments are meaningful. So not just giving a school district our tough books, but how do we make sure that the digital literacy is a component of teacher professional development? So that's also an area that we're thinking through strategically of making sure that it's not just a nice grant or a nice photo op donation with our computers, but really building meaningful relationships in those communities and really ensuring that we have strong thought leadership from all the partners involved so that we can start seeing some real action in the communities that most need it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks,
yeah, and the good thing on the...
had some connectivity issues there myself, so sorry if I missed a couple of seconds of your answer there.
Yeah, and the good thing on the educational side is that you know, we're getting better at pinpointing where the problems are. So whether it's through the FCC mapping activity or UNICEF Giga project, where Ericsson is a participant to map out schools in 35 countries. So we're getting better and better at the pinpointing part. And we too, as Alejandro mentioned, have a strong focus on the school side, on the education side. So we trained over 200,000 students from 2010 with a target of 1 million by 2025. And this is a combination of online and remote learning. And one thing we found from COVID is a lot more enthusiasm from our volunteers from the company. I guess there's just this awareness that this is something that really needs to be solved. So I think, you know, there's good news ahead on this topic.
And all of you work for global businesses. Have you seen differences in how different regions are approaching this issue, be that through, you know, government subsidies or regulations or other aspects? We've mentioned a few specific programs, and for instance, how does the US approach compared to Europe?
Look, I think in the US, where most of my business is located, it goes back to the accessibility, affordability piece, where through the broadband fund, as well as through the FUSIV fund and the RDOF fund, there's enough funds available to build out technology and connectivity for the rural markets. So I think that's a good thing. And I think the earlier point Mike made is being open to non-fiber solutions. Of course, we love fiber, but being open to non-fiber in the spirit of getting connectivity, I think that's a lot of progress the country has made in the last couple of RDOF rounds that we've seen in the space. I do think we've got more work to do as a society at large to handle the affordability piece. I think we've got some programs in place, mostly led by the school districts, and as well as the recent stimulus funding did give some piece. But I would really like to see more work on the affordability, especially for lower income groups. If they have access but they can't afford it, it's not worth much.
And how about health? That was also mentioned a moment ago. And obviously, for non-urgent or non-COVID procedures, some people's only access to health will have been through a screen like this. What have we seen on that? And, you know, have governments done the right thing, and have businesses done the right thing in addressing that gulf?
Look,
well,
we feel quite good about... Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Okay, sorry, we have a slight delay on our talking. Yeah, I mean, I think education, health, small and medium-sized business, all three are topics of concern that kind of came out more vociferously because of the COVID issue. So all of them need to be addressed. And, one of the things that we're learning is that, guess what, video has, it started off as an experiment at the beginning of COVID, and now we take it for granted. And that drives with it different kinds of traffic and different kinds of connectivity demands. So as we start to solve this, we need to consider these new use cases, so to speak, and what kind of requirements they have.
Now, Alejandra, you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion your experience in government. How have you brought that to bear? I mean, and do you think government is kind of asking the right questions and doing the right things from your kind of side on, time on the other side of the equation?
I definitely think that when it comes to education, addressing the digital divide, addressing health disparities, we can work across the aisle. I think my experience in government gave me the opportunity to be able to now step into the private sector where I have resources and I have more opportunity to think creatively about immediate action to deploy those resources. So I think that there's a lot we can do to really just leverage both institutions. And again, I really do think that public-private partnerships matter more today, more than ever. I'd like us to, really think about how collectively as a company, Panasonic can work with the Department of Education, with our state and local municipalities that are advancing these issues. So, I mean, I think we can work across the aisle on these issues. And that's something that I saw in my time. It's something I want to continue. At the end of the day, I think if you want to make meaningful change in communities, especially communities of color, I think that there's a way for us to work collectively. We want to reimagine who can be a scientist, who can be an engineer. For us as a tech company, that matters. So access to STEM education, making sure kids are connected, that's a huge priority for us as a company, especially as we think about the future of work and we think about being able to compete in the 21st century globally. We want to do our role to make sure that students are prepared. And I think government's role, the private sector, the nonprofit role, if we can come collectively together, I think that's what I'm striving towards in the work of the Panasonic Foundation.
There's also been an interesting shift historically, at least in the US. We've been a very three-stakeholder society. Most large companies, which is customers, and customers, employee. But now we have added the fourth piece, which is society. And you've seen the shift in the last couple of years for us. For us, it's at an operational level. When I sit with my CEO and go through our operations review every month, we have a four-stakeholder conversation. What do you do for your customers? What do you do for employees? And then what did you do for society at large where this comes in? So there's a clear shift I see in the Americas towards that piece. So I think that plus what the governments are doing, the time is right to make an impact on this.
Yeah, and I think you, both Alejandro and Sampath, bring up some great points in that as we solve the digital divide, we also bring a level playing field to the to great disparity in terms of job availability and employment. So, for example, now you can imagine workers in very remote locations doing work remotely for a company maybe a few hundred miles away and have a high-paying job. And you could be disabled or you could be in a rural community. So it levels the playing field, which has great social impact, I think, on a long-term basis. It's also a great source for new employees for companies. We've had a couple of examples like that, but one that comes to mind is we're starting up a factory here right near me in Louisville, Texas. And due to COVID, we couldn't get trainers over, so we had similar factory a few thousand miles away, and we did remote training with augmented reality glasses. So now imagine you introduce some automation to that, and suddenly you could have employees working in in the middle of Oklahoma, setting up a factory in Louisville. So it has fantastic and positive social implications as well.
That sounds like a really compelling pitch, Mike, that your clients and also municipalities might maybe want to partner with you on as well. So that kind of would help, fulfill some of those remote working opportunities in the future, perhaps.
That's right. And it creates, like I mentioned before, this virtual circle where, you create the employment, potentially that helps open up businesses, and then you end up creating a system where it's self-sustaining.
And just a bigger point, you all work in communications and technology, so you all understood how central it is and how important it is, but nonetheless, I think we've all been surprised by various things over the last couple of years. And I just wondered if there's anything that's actually changed how you think about your work and the sector, any moments that have kind of changed, surprised you effectively over the last couple of years.
Look, I think the biggest one for us has been go ahead.
Sorry.
The lag is big.
Yeah, that delay, apologies. I think the last couple of, like this last year and a half under the pandemic, we were, as a company, we've had our Panasonic Foundation has been in existence for 3 decades. And one of the things for us was advancing educational equity. We have a greater sense of urgency given the magnified level of poverty in this country and the issues that we saw in communities where we have a geographic presence. And I'll give you an example. We were focused on STEM education. When the pandemic hit, we had to pivot to address food insecurity. And from there, we've been now thinking about making sure we have strong strategic partnerships with those organizations that could also pivot. We were funding through this partnership with the Skyhook Foundation, we were funding a summer camp to expose students, low-income students, to access to STEM curriculum. They pivoted and they had a mobile truck going into after-school centers where students could gather safely under the pandemic to ensure that we could continue to provide hands-on STEM access. So if anything, I think these past 2 years going through this pandemic has really allowed us just to think outside of the box. It's not just us trying to advance STEM education, but also thinking about those other issues that are impacting communities today, like food insecurity, like some of the health disparities that we've seen. So as a company, we're trying to make sure that, if it's through our products or through our future innovations, that we can play our role to be more strategic about just the real needs that are facing our communities of color.
That's great, thanks. And Sampath, I think you were about to say something before. I should have said who I wanted to speak first, but I'm interested in everything. So,
yeah, look, I think for us, the way we think about it is connectivity is so critical, more critical than ever before, as I kind of mentioned before. Another is the role of small businesses. One of the things we see is 40% of small businesses don't have a digital presence. And I think another 30% of them have a very poor digital presence. So 7 out of 10 small businesses don't have a credible digital outlet. And you're going to see the disparity between large companies and small businesses expand. So that's been one of our biggest takeaways in the last couple of years is how small businesses need to go back and catch up on technology. Now, with broadband being relatively cheap and available widely, with SaaS solutions available widely, with devices available widely and at good price points, the time is perfect for that. Small businesses have to catch up. The deli round the corner, the local ramen shop, the local, the clothes shop here, they got to find a way to compete against the really large companies. And closing that digital experience and the digital presence is very critical, more so than ever before.
Yeah, I think echoing Alejandro, I think the learning is that, guess what, this is permanent. So, the change in patterns of work and connectivity since COVID are permanent. So that's one, let's say, surprise. But on the positive side, I think there's a recognition within our employee base more so than before. And we also recognize that it's not just the connectivity part. You also need the affordability part and the education and as Sampath said, the small and medium-sized business support. So I just find there's a greater enthusiasm within the company around this topic, and that can only be positive.
Well, we could continue this for much longer, I'm sure, but unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for. So just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of our speakers, and thank you for listening.